important, which is to think about that downside risk and just help manage through that. So maybe I can open with the presentation, and if we turn that to, say, slide 4, just as Ben mentioned, and I'll just give it a minute to flip over. Is that coming through the hopefully you can see the presentation.
We're just changing the slides now.
No worries. Well, I think as we look at the slides, the first one that I was going to refer to is really what Ben was alluding to, which is that we're very focused at Magellan at protecting the capital on the downside. Over the long term, we're looking to return for you 9%, above 9% after fees, and that is over the long term. So sometimes it might be a bit less, but we've been lucky enough or successful enough to be able to say we've been able to perform better than that over time. But that is what we're aiming for. And then key to that is really around minimizing that risk of permanent capital loss, because that's what makes, as I was mentioning to Ben before we started, it's almost, we've made as much money for clients by not losing their money in the first place as we have on the other side. And so that is a key feature of our investment thesis. And you can see, if you have a look on page 5, just to give you a real example of that, is this downside protection. So if you have a look back at sort of various periods of time, and we've given a few examples there, which we'll turn over in a moment, but say the subprime crisis with Bear Stearns, in that situation, we returned a sort of negative 2%. You can see on the top right-hand side when the MSCI World, which is our benchmark, was down 9%. So we outperformed by about 7% there. And then most recently at the bottom there, on bottom right-hand side, you can see our reference to the COVID-19 crisis, when during February and March, the MSCI World was down 21% and we were down 15%. So we've continued to consistently try and outperform as much as possible by just managing your money in a way that is, I guess, pretty conservative, but at the same time, you do benefit from that upside, and that makes a big difference to our returns over a long period of time. So with that, why don't I just take a moment to step into what we see as we look at the macroeconomic environment. So as we turn over to the couple of pages forward on slide 7, as we think about COVID-19, there's really two things that we're most focused on. Firstly is the economic and the business impact. I think we have to recognize that there's a potential here, and we've seen that, in fact, over the last few weeks, for almost total collapse in demand in some businesses. And we have actually seen some businesses lose close to 100% of their revenues. We're also expecting unemployment to rise. And I think we need to differentiate here between what is self-inflicted. So the sort of unemployment that comes about because all the restaurants and things have been shut down. And that's one aspect of it, but almost the more important is the enduring aspect of it. So what part of that employment will come back once those restaurants are able to reopen, but how much of it are we then going into a more traditional recession? And that's what we're thinking about as we look sort of forward. I will say it is very challenging to predict the depth of that slowdown, how long that will go on for, but we're going to talk through in a few minutes the different outcomes that we see and what's going to really drive one outcome versus another. And I think key to which outcome actually prevails is all around the policymaker response. And you'll see that's the second point here on this slide. What's key in that policymaker response is just to reduce that upward pressure on unemployment. And I'm thinking more about that longer term unemployment. And so it's really key to keep businesses in business, even during these lockdown phases that we're seeing around the world, so that when you do get the opportunity to reopen, there's a job for people to go back to. And we'll talk through sort of some of those dynamics a little bit more. As we think about what is actually required there, you're really looking for fiscal stimulus. We think fiscal stimulus is actually more important than monetary stimulus at this point. We'll talk about that in a moment. We're talking about some pretty big numbers, so 20 to 30% of GDP. So if you think it's sort of the US economy at kind of 20 trillion in GDP, there's some pretty big figures out there. Now, obviously, the US government has already provided kind of 10% of their GDP, and we're seeing more potential additional stimulus coming through. And we saw that over the weekend, the House of Representatives there passed a $3 trillion bill. And so we'll see if that moves forward. But that's really what we're focused on, is what is the government actually doing for people to help them through this period? Because we think that is what's going to really have an impact on the markets. So as we're moving over to the next slide, you can see that we've just highlighted there the policymaker response. And there's really sort of two halves to that, as I mentioned. There's a fiscal policy and then there's monetary policy. I'm going to start with fiscal policy because we're quite focused on that area, and I'll talk about why in a moment. But ultimately, it's really the governments that can actually prevent businesses from failing. You know, central banks, they can provide a lot of money, but it's very difficult for them to really get the money into the hands of consumers, into the hands of businesses. That's something that you rely on from the governments per se to come up with policies that are actually going to make that difference. Now, one of the things to think about as you think about the effectiveness of that is obviously just partisan politics can be a real headwind to that fiscal response. And it also matters in the way that different, sides want to see that fiscal response implemented. Is it through tax cuts? Is it through direct support? Is it through loans where they're required to use those loans to actually pay employees and get money back in the hands of consumers? So that's important to think about as we look at the permutations and combinations in terms of the way that this could play out. So we think about that and that need for fiscal stimulus. The logical sort of follow on from that is we think that the more developed markets, and China in particular, a better place to fund that fiscal stimulus, particularly countries where their debts, they have control over their currency. They don't have debts in sort of a foreign currency or in US dollars. It's really that they have a little bit more control of their economy, and certainly China falls into that bucket as well. We think it does become a bit more challenging when you look at countries that have very high government debt, or they're particularly reliant on oil, just where the oil price is, as I'm sure you would have seen, that's dropped down now to around $30, which is well off its highs, and that makes a big difference to a lot of countries in terms of their ability just to fund social programs. So if you think about that policymaker response, that fiscal policy is very important. I don't want to get away from the fact that monetary policy is still important. We just think it's a little bit less effective than it was historically in terms of promoting growth, just because we came into this crisis already at some pretty low levels of interest rates. And so that additional cut, what sort of difference is that going to make? Central banks over time have been much more effective at sort of maintaining that market stability, to making sure that liquidity is there, that there's not going to be that run on the bank and people really start panicking that their savings aren't going to be there when they want them. But as I mentioned earlier, in terms of getting money into the hands of businesses and consumers, that's better directed from the fiscal side. So we sort of bring all of that together. There's kind of two, I guess, investment implications that are relevant. The first is on the fiscal side, which is that we're focused on those regions and those governments, so developed markets in China, which are in a better place to be able to take care of their people and take care of their economies effectively. So that's one element of how we've been thinking about our investments in this environment. And then the other thing is, as we look at what monetary policy can do, we do think interest rates are going to stay lower for longer. And that's what's really driven some of our other investments, which I'll talk through shortly. But just the central banks we expect will continue to try and support the economies by keeping those interest rates low. So just moving over onto the next slide, I just wanted to give you kind of an overview. We've broken kind of the potential outcomes into four big buckets, for want of a better expression. But firstly, there's what we call, and now we're in the letters, and you'll see in the press, there's V's and there's U's and there's W's and there's L's. And I saw one fund manager put out a letter the other day that even had a Q, which I think means they just don't know, but which I have some sympathy for. But on the left-hand side, you can see there we've got a V-shaped recovery or a U-shaped recovery. And we would say they were the better outcomes. And on the far right-hand side, you can see we've got that potential for a prolonged or very deep recession or even a depression. And what's going to drive those things is, a big part of that is around the policymaker response. So on the left-hand side, we're more likely to get a V or a U where we see larger policy responses, which are very timely and very effective. If we don't see much movement on the policy front, then we're going to, there's more likelihood that we'll move into the right-hand side. And I'm going to talk through on the next slide sort of each of those potential outcomes, excuse me, each of those potential outcomes and what that really means and how the governments can actually change their policies to make a real difference here. So turning on to the next slide, just the policy response there, we've got what we call an outcome, so that V-shaped recovery. And the way we think about this is there's essentially been a shutdown in the ability of businesses to generate revenue as a result of that reduction in consumer spend, what we call sort of an output gap. That GDP has sort of disappeared. So who's going to cover that output gap? And it's really who covers that output gap that is going to help drive the recovery scenario. So if we think about a V-shaped recovery, we see that coming about if that output gap is basically transferred to everybody. So the government to central bank balance sheets through quantitative easing. Excuse me. So that's sort of key to getting to that particular outcome. On the top right-hand side, we have a look at, can you just excuse me for 1 minute while I grab some water, because I think that'll make the rest of the presentation a little bit more effective. Just a moment.
Sure, that's fine. So I'll just use this brief pause just to remind people that have a look at the bottom panel in your screen. There's a Q&A icon there, and if you'd like to submit any questions, I'll be able to see those and refer those to Rosie at the conclusion of the presentation.
Here we go. Appreciate the break, because I think that will make it more useful, more better commentary. So then if we look at the kind of the outcome from the U-shaped recovery, what does that actually mean versus the V-shaped recovery? And this is the output gap. Most of that is transferred to governments and to central banks, maybe not all of it, but a large part of it, and the rest of it to society. And I think it's important to think about the way that that's transferred to society, because we see a U-shaped recovery as more likely if businesses are essentially covered for a period of time for the revenue they would have generated, as opposed to sort of just putting cash in consumers' pockets. That's not to say putting cash in consumers' pockets doesn't help, but what's really important if we think about the long term is that when the economy does open back up, there's a job to go back to. And so if you have a situation where you put a lot of pressure on businesses to the point where we start to see an increasing number of bankruptcies, even when you get out of this period, there's no job for people to have. And that's sort of what leads us to the third scenario, which is a more prolonged and deep recession, which is sort of where, sure, workers are compensated for some of their lost wages, but the underlying businesses end up in so much trouble that they don't exist, or some portion of them don't exist after we come out of this lockdown period. And then the fourth option is essentially where, this is sort of the depression scenario where governments don't do anything. And we think that's pretty unlikely. We are seeing governments respond around the world, but that doesn't say, as we went into this process before we sort of saw what the government response would be, that there wasn't in our minds the potential for a very kind of long period of depression type economic circumstances, which would not have been a good outcome for people or their investment portfolios, obviously. That would be a situation where that output gap was basically just put onto businesses and put onto households. So we're seeing different governments around the world are doing different things. We're seeing some, which was probably kind of a more Singapore, Denmark, which are closer to number one. We haven't seen sort of number four as yet, and then other businesses, whether the US, Australia, are sort of somewhere between 2 and 3. And so because when we think about what's happening with the virus, and, Australia's done a pretty good job, but other areas are still seeing a large number of cases, we think the chance for that V-shaped recovery is less likely, and that's probably around 10%. We also think that the chance for the very negative scenarios, so that depression scenario, is probably around 10% as well. And then we're sort of in the middle between whether it's a U or a V. So let's say 40% each, just to put kind of a number on it. But ultimately, we're watching it very closely to work out what is that policy response and what does that mean? And sort of longer term, what is that likely to do to consumers and their behavior and the way that they're spending? So maybe with that, I can turn over, because all of that sort of feeds into the bigger picture and what are we actually doing with our portfolio? What are the changes that we've made? What are some of the things that we're thinking about? So if we move over there to slide 12, there's a couple of things that we did pretty early on in this process. We moved to a lot more cash. So you can see at the top there, we've got cash at the end of December at about 6% cash. And we have that CRR is called a combined risk ratio. It's sort of like a beta calculation, sort of how much exposure do we have to the market. And we were sitting pretty close to kind of 0.8%, 0.8, which is where that's sort of the limits of where our fund can get to. Now we fast forward and we look at where we're at in March 2020. We've sort of close to tripled the amount of cash that we have. So gone from that 6% through to that 17%. And we've taken our risk ratio way down. So we've gone from 0.8 down to a little under 0.7. And the aim behind that was just to protect the portfolio on the downside, to make sure that we didn't have as much exposure to the markets, because we do think it's very difficult to see forward from here. and we would rather potentially miss a little bit of the upside or the turnaround, and also not be in a position where we're going to lose a lot of money on the downside. And so that was the bigger picture overlay as we look forward. As I mentioned, we've got the 4 different scenarios and just trying to work out which one plays out. It is difficult to see, and we recognize that. We're not trying to sort of play in an area where we don't have the insight to be definitive on it. But there have been some other sort of tweaks we've made through our portfolio, which I think are interesting, and I just wanted to highlight so you get a sense of what we're really doing. The first thing we did is we maintained exposure to very resilient businesses, and in fact, we increased our exposure there. So what do we mean when we talk about a resilient business? You can see there's a group of companies there: Xcel Energy, Eversource. These are big utilities in the US, so pretty stable demand. We've got Reckitt Beckensur, which you might know as Dettol. So if you think about the kind of, and Lysol, those sort of products, the demand for those products has obviously increased, and we see the potential for there to be a longer term sustained increase in demand for those products, as we think people will come out of this more likely to wash your hands that much more likely to sanitize that much more, keep your house that much cleaner. And so we see a real opportunity for kind of sustained improvement in their revenue generating capabilities. Nestle and PepsiCo, they're both very stable businesses with, sort of food products. This is not, these things that you're going to pay for. It's not sort of a luxury handbag that you might need to, you decide you don't need to buy. So you can see that we've moved the percentage of the portfolio in those sort of businesses from 25% through to 27%. The other thing that we did was reduce our cyclical risk. So you see we've got a group of companies there: Alphabet, which you'll know as Google, Facebook, MasterCard, Visa, and Apple. We actually no longer own Apple, as you can see there. And as you think about that, just that demand, the Apple iPhone is pretty expensive, and people could probably, in a downturn, hang on for the existing phone a little bit longer and therefore not spend the money on replacing that. And so that has got some element of cyclical exposure, which we wanted to take down. Alphabet and Facebook are both exposed to advertising spend, and often companies will pull back on that, particularly in this environment when maybe the consumers aren't out and about buying and spending in any case. And then Visa and MasterCard, they obviously have a meaningful amount of their business exposed to things like travel and entertainment. And so we've sort of reduced that whole group of cyclical businesses down from, that's where we've made the big change, or the biggest change in all of our group weightings, from 25% to 18% of the portfolio. There are a few businesses which we think will continue to do well. So, we're here working on Zoom, but another example that people have been using, a Zoom example, is Microsoft Teams is getting a workout as people are working from home. So those kind of businesses, which we think will keep being used throughout this period and remain relevant. So we think around enterprise and that China technology, we've kept our percentage there at about 19%. So Alibaba, Tencent, SAP, and Microsoft. The restaurants, we've liked these restaurants, and we do like them in a downturn generally because they are generally pretty defensive. It's a relatively cost-effective way of eating and eating out. We have taken that down just a little bit, just to keep, just being aware of the fact that there is a period of time where these restaurants may not have demand, just because we may see sort of opening and closing as we try and manage through this COVID situation, which may come back once we start to try and open. So we've taken those down a little bit, but not too much. The other areas where we've made reductions is that affluent Chinese consumer. We do still like China, as I mentioned generally, but it is still a very, it is that extra luxury handbag. Will they need that? And we've reduced our exposure to some of that kind of discretionary spend around the world. So we've taken those positions down from a combined 8% to a 6%. And then lastly, some of our other holdings, which we like, but there are certain issues with them in the near term, and we've just reduced those a little bit. So things like ABI, which is Budweiser beer, if you know of that brand in the US, for instance, or Heineken beer. A large part of those businesses are exposed to kind of restaurants and going out and nightclubs and things. And that obviously we've just seen a bit of a pullback in that, or expect to see kind of a pullback in people's utilization of those services. And so we've reduced those positions a little bit as well. So hopefully that gives you an overview of sort of how we've thought about repositioning the portfolio in the context of what we see from a macro perspective. Again, there's a range of outcomes here, and we sort of think we're going to be in that that U-shaped type outcome, but at the same time, we're sort of positioning the portfolio for a downside and to make sure that we are correct or appropriately positioned, just given the risk that we see out there. So Ben, that might be a good opportunity. I can jump in and answer the questions that you had sent through that had come through before we started, and then maybe we can take any questions that have come through the Q&A now, if that's...
Sure. Yeah, that would be great. Thanks very much, Rosie.
So one of the questions was, is now a good time to be investing in China? We still like China. As I mentioned earlier, we think that government is in a relatively good position to be able to help manage through this, just given the control they've got over this society. One part of the question was, are we likely to see production? I think it's a very good question. Are we likely to see governments around the world move production away from China and maybe bring it back on shore? I do think there's a potential of that, although as a firm, I think it's more likely that we'll see that very strategically in specific industries. So we might see that in masks, for instance. We might see it in certain vaccines where the US decides, or other developed markets decide to bring that production back on shore. But to bring all of that production on shore would be a huge undertaking and have flow-on effects in terms of just the cost of consumer goods, which would sort of potentially hurt consumers at a time when they don't have as much money as they did before. And so we don't, it's hard to see that happening en masse, although it's not totally out of the question, but I do think it's more likely to be very strategic industries, which are not a huge part of the economy. Another question which is top of mind for everyone is around the election, the US election, and is President Trump likely to be re-elected? And what is that impact is that going to have on markets? This is a really interesting question. It's something we debate a lot at our macroeconomic committee. We're just trying to work through, we think the risk is actually more that Joe Biden and the Democrats, Joe Biden is in the White House after this next election cycle. And we see that as a risk because those policies that they're likely to bring in are going to be quite different to what we've seen over the last few years. And then there is the potential for increased taxation, but at the same time, there's also the potential for increased infrastructure spend. But as we look at some of the polls coming through, and we can see what happened for instance, in one of the states, Wisconsin, that was in the middle of April, they had an election for someone to their Supreme Court, and the Republicans sort of went out of their way to make it very difficult for people to vote in the hope that that would support their own incumbent. And instead, everyone came out. They closed most of the polling stations. They only had about 5 open from memory. And people came out in force, and they just stood in line 1.5 meters apart for 3 hours to be able to vote. And ultimately, the Democratic nominee was put in place in that Supreme Court. So there's potential for that kind of blue wave to sweep across the US. And that's something that we're watching very closely as well, and keeping an eye on what that might mean in terms of policies that Joe Biden's likely to bring in, what that might mean for markets. So it's certainly a very topical question. One of the other questions that have come through, is there a model where there's no vaccine created and this risk is enduring? I think there is a model that happens. I don't think a vaccine has ever been produced in less than 4 years. Having said that, there's so much energy and effort around the world being put into this that it is possible. But I do think we have to consider the fact that maybe we won't get a vaccine, and what we might end up happening is we end up getting to a point where there's just herd immunity, but we could end up seeing kind of economies opening and then closing and then opening and closing for a rolling period of time until we can get to that herd immunity, or we can get to the vaccine. As we think about sort of the investment incomes, that's going to have an impact on consumers' willingness to spend and businesses' willingness to invest. And so we do think about that in terms of a downside risk, and that's something that as we sort of keep that 17% so on cash, that's part of the reason why, is to help protect against that potential outcome, or a potential outcome along those lines. The last question that had come through kind of before we started today was just around, as an international manager, how are we staying in contact with our clients? Well, it's actually very similar to what Ben's doing with all of you, which is not just our clients, but also the companies that we invest in. And we spend a lot of time with them now on phone calls. In fact, they're being very responsive. They're keen to stay in touch with their key shareholders. We're lucky, just the nature of our investment process, which is very long term. We're a welcome shareholder on their register, and so something that they do like to kind of respond to us when we need help or need some help understanding what's happening with their businesses. And so we've found that we've been able to be in contact with management teams just as if we would if we were face to face, but it's been done through a Zoom meeting or a Microsoft Teams meeting or on the phone. We've been able to get the same access that we would always have despite COVID, which has been positive.
Thank you very much, Rosie. I've just received one other question, and it relates to the fact that you're holding much higher levels of cash at the moment for very valid reasons. But the question is, what would be the triggers that you'd be looking for to invest that into the market, and when do you believe that those triggers might present themselves?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We are holding obviously a lot of cash. As we look forward, we would want to see sort of a sustained recovery, and it's really about how's the virus going to play out, and then what would the policymaker response. But if we can see businesses reopening for a period of time and we don't see mass waves of ongoing pressure from that virus, we may find in the north that in the northern hemisphere, that the onset of summer, for instance, helps with the virus. We don't know if that's going to be true or not, because the virus is behaved differently than other viruses in lots of different ways. So we're really sort of looking at that, looking at the way that any additional stimulus that might come through, the way that the governments are working together. It's very difficult to say at this point in time, though, exactly when we would look to redeploy that cash, but we would want to see sort of sustained improvements in sort of businesses coming back, and our ability, and the world's ability, I guess, to manage the virus, not just Australia's ability to manage the virus.
And the final question that's just come in, Rosie, do you think there's going to be a change in the Chinese appetite to invest in Australia, both in businesses and also property?
It's a good question. I actually don't, I have to say, I don't have a strong view, and so I don't want to sort of speak out of, with ignorance, because I don't think that's going to be a particularly helpful answer in terms of their willingness to invest in Australia per se. I think that's more kind of what's going on with the politics at the moment, and obviously the Australian government has raised certain issues around the coronavirus and how it originated, and asked for an investigation into what happened, and that's created tension. And so there is the potential that China will decide to pull back on some of the investments that it's made. But I also think in the long term, the Australian economy is something that they've been ties for quite some time. So it's difficult to say how long that would last for and how long that would go on for.
Terrific. They're all the questions that have come through. Thank you very much again. It was a very informative presentation. As always, with presentations from Magellan, you're able to distill very, very complex themes and present it very succinctly into key points that clients can take away and understand. And I appreciate also the fact that you had just a small number of slides. Sometimes in presentations it becomes death by PowerPoint, but just being able to succinctly group those into key areas and graphically represent it very succinctly assists in the understanding of that information. So thank you very, very much. I wish you were here in person so I could present a small gift for you, but we'll organise for something to be sent up to Sydney for you. And also Felicity, thank you very much for arranging the webinar. As a final note to clients, thank you very much for taking out the time to attend. As I mentioned earlier, there will be an email that goes out with a link to an online survey. It'd be greatly appreciated if you could complete that, so it will assist us to structure future events that will be of value to you. Thank you very much again.
Thank you for your time, Ben.
Thank you.
Bye.